Brian Slagel here on 100 Songs That Define Heavy Metal podcast. I am the CEO of Metal Blade Records, home to, over the years, Metallica, Slayer, Amon Amarth, Cannibal Corpse, Fates Warning, Gwar, and a million more. Anyway, this episode, we were talking about one of the most classic heavy metal songs of all time, if not the most classic, War Pigs by Black Sabbath. We will, of course, welcome in Mr. Martin Popoff, who will give us some background on the song. Then we're going to talk with our own Christian Bladt, the producer of this show, to talk about the production of the song. And then I'm going to welcome in my good friend Phil Rind, the bass player and leader of Sacred Reich, who also did an amazing cover of this song. So I will now hand it over to Martin Popoff.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, War Pigs, absolute classic, of course, 7 minutes and 57 seconds long, off the Paranoid album, September 18th, 1970. They were going to call the album War Pigs, of course. This was like the flagship song. It's the opening song. It's an epic with all sorts of changes and interesting parts to it. Fast parts, slow parts, very cool. A lot of really doomy, cool melody. It's kind of a progressive rock song. Because of the debate over the Vietnam War at the time, which was very contentious, the title War Pigs sounded a little bit hard-hitting. So they decided to go with Paranoid, which still, I think, lines up with the album cover well enough. This song goes back a long ways. It was called Walpurgis earlier on. It had more satanic, witchcrafty sort of lyrics. To quote from my book, and I talked to all these guys about this song in my book, Sabotage, Black Sabbath in the 70s, Geezer said this was totally against the Vietnam War at the time, about how these rich politicians and rich people in general, they started all the wars for their benefit and get all the poor people to die for them, which is still happening now. Talks about the cover as well. Somebody came up with a picture, recalls Bill, in further corroboration of the title fitting the record, and we were like, okay, all right, not too bad. But the working title for the album was War Pigs. Warner Brothers didn't want it to be called War Pigs, which would make more sense at the time. Record companies have to take care of how they look at everything. And then Tony said we used to sort of jam around with War Pigs. Again, some of the songs were actually put together when we were in Europe. We used to play at these clubs, playing 45-minute spots a day, and we would get bored because there would only be a handful of people in them, and we would start making songs up, and War Pig was one of those. Bill thought it was at the Beat Club Hirschen, he says, which I think was in Zurich, Switzerland. It was a real horrible place, basically full of prostitutes and some of the Johns that used to come in for the prostitutes. But as I recall, we were starting to put those things together at the time, would have been roughly 1968. Geezer says it's just a reflection of society, real life. Everyone has their point of view. I used to write like that. It's just an observation of society. I'm not preaching or trying to come up with any answers. Of course, the cool thing about War Pigs is that amazing stop-start sequence to the verse, which doesn't happen a lot of times in the songs. I think it's only a couple times sort of thing.
Generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Those big slamming chords, and then Bill just doing the on the hi-hat. So really cool. Ozzy has to sing essentially a cappella at this. But yeah, then there's a lot of interesting drumming in this as well, where Bill does some really kind of off-kilter rhythmic things. It is definitely the flagship song from the album. Of course, we have Iron Man on there as well, and Paranoid, a bunch of other cool songs. This was a huge, huge album for them. Their second album that they did in 1970. So it's an absolute rock classic. They played it many, many times. It became one that Ozzy liked as well. Geezer also says, I think you have to be a fan of politics if you live in the world. You're subjected to politics, and it's always a good subject to write about, good for musicians and comedians. Back then it was more about the Vietnam era, because we used to get a lot more things on television in England than anybody ever did in America. They would show like all the propaganda that was going on the TV in England. People didn't know what I was talking about when I came over here, because they weren't allowed to see that on TV, and we just thought England was going to be next to be dragged into the Vietnam War. I grew up post-World War II, and the area we lived in Birmingham was bombed out during the war, and it was still being rebuilt when I was growing up. And I knew a lot of families whose fathers were killed in World War II. My uncle was shot in World War II, so war really affected me. And my brothers had to join the army. One of them had to go fight in Egypt. So it was all very real to me, and it was all scary in a way. And when the Vietnam thing came in, people were saying it was really bad and England was going to join in. So that's why we wrote War Pigs. So very cool. Amazing, amazing song. And yeah, one of those really exciting, complicated action-packed structures that Black Sabbath became known for. And, they had a hit album off the first album, and they had a hit album on this one, and they were well on the way. So there you go, Black Sabbath, War.
So what do you want?
What do I want? I want to use my degree for good, and in general.
I kind of meant like a muffin or a latte.
I want a job with a generous work-from-grocery store policy.
You are here a lot.
Debbie, please, I'm working.
I want a job that will change the world.
Ma'am, this is a drive-thru.
And some nuggets.
With LinkedIn's new AI-powered job search, you can find roles that match your unique skills, so you can dare to discover more. Visit linkedin.com/jobs to learn more.
Thanks, Martin. As always, a lot of interesting information in there. So now I don't have to bring up a lot of that. I had prepared to talk about the album being called War Pigs and the Walpurgis and all that stuff that Martin so eloquently explained, which is really cool. So now we're going to talk, as we do every episode, about the production of this song. And just to be a little bit different this time, I'm going to bring in the producer of this show and also the man who created this show and is probably the reason this show exists more than anybody else, Christian Bladt. Christian, how are you?
I'm doing great. The best thing about having Martin on the show is like when you think you know a lot about one of the songs, you're like, oh yeah, he knew all that and so much more, so.
Exactly. So just to give a little bit of background, you guys may or may not know the story, but Christian is a longtime legendary guy in the podcast and entertainment world. He worked with Dennis Miller for many, many years and is also a big rock and metal fan. So he had heard me on Eddie Trunk a couple times and asked me, would you want to do a podcast? So I said, well, let's talk. So we spoke and he came up with basically more or less the designs for this format and this show. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Then it was on pause for a while until we could find the correct distributor. And that's when our good friends at Pantheon also asked me if I was interested in doing a podcast. I said, well, I actually have one that's kind of ready to go. So we had a meeting and they greenlit it, and here we are today. So thank you for all that, Christian. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. And, I've been involved in pitching a lot of things in my career, and pitching the guys at Pantheon was the most fun because, I don't know, Brian, we were maybe 2 minutes in and they were already talking like they were doing it. You know what I mean? Yeah. It wasn't like, okay, well, we'll think about it. We'll get back to you. They're like, no, this is great. We love you. We love the idea. Let's start figuring out how to get the pilot episode.
Yeah, very cool so far. A lot of fun. So I figured I'd bring you in because we haven't brought you really in for much yet. So it would be kind of fun to talk about this production on this song. And it's really interesting because really this is just live. I mean, they recorded this album in 6 days. On only 3 of them they actually recorded, and the other 3 were basically mixing. And it's, of course, Roger Bain, who did the first record, and Tom Allom, who was the engineer, who we ended up talking a lot about in our Judas Priest episode because he produced all the big Priest albums, including Screaming for Vengeance. So this was kind of the early version of Tom Allom. If you read any of the guys' books, they'll talk, quite a bit about this record. And they just basically set up in a studio, mic'd it, and recorded. It's just a 4-track recording, so there's not a million overdubs or anything. It's very simple, which you can kind of tell from listening to it. But it's really just them playing live, and they did it so quickly that, the first record I think they did in a day, recorded, and this one was like a whole 3 days. So it's crazy how quickly this stuff happened.
Yeah, interesting that the band first associated with Satanism is the one who made an album quicker than it took God to make the world. They're like, oh yeah, well, all right, we can do this in 6. Listening to it, you really get that feel for its live. I love that, getting that feel. And nowadays when a band records like this, it's such a big deal. It's like, oh, we were all actually in the studio and playing at the same time. It was revolutionary. Here it's just like, well, we only had enough money for 6 days.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, even we talked about the, recording Show No Mercy, which I think we did in like 10 days. But yeah, a thing that amazes me too about this is, this is really When it all comes down to it, and most people point to this particular song, and I will not necessarily disagree with them. This was the actual beginning of heavy metal. Was really this song and this album. Obviously, the first Sabbath record is amazing, and that certainly set the stage. But this, you talk to authors and historians and all these different people, and everybody's got a different opinion about pinpoint when things happen. But it's pretty much, we all go back to this song, and this was kind of the first really big heavy metal song, especially back in the day when it first came out. Like, people first heard it, it's like 8 minutes long, and it's kind of crazy how it all has come around, and it still sounds just as good. And I listened to it the other day because I haven't listened to the studio version for a while, and it still sounds as fresh today as it did 50 years ago.
Interestingly, one of the things I wanted to mention in our conversation is I first heard this song when I was 14. But the first version I ever heard was the Faith No More version on their album Epic. I knew Paranoid, I knew Iron Man, but I didn't know this song. And fortunately, my dad had this crazy vinyl collection that started in 1965, and it went right up to 1974 when he met my mom. So I was like, oh, I wonder if he has Black Sabbath. He had the first 2 records, and I was like, oh, let me hear this. So you put it on, and you just try, this is like 1990, I think. And I'm trying to imagine 1970, somebody getting this and putting this on and going did their ears start bleeding from hearing something like this? And the style of the song, the stops and starts that Martin talked about, the solos, and sort of the way that you can hear everybody presenting their instruments. It's like everything that metal becomes is it's all in this 8 minutes. It's like, this is like heavy metal 101. Listen to these 8 minutes. Don't do an 8-minute song necessarily, but you can pick and choose some things, and then you'll be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it encompasses so much of what the genre has become. There's the progressive stuff, there's the catchy stuff, there's the lyrical stuff. I mean, kind of everything goes kind of perfectly together. I don't know if I would describe it necessarily this way, because there are a few songs that I like better than this one in terms of just overall metal songs. But I mean, it's kind of the perfect heavy metal song.
Yeah, from the topic, the lyrics, positioned as this anti-war song, but also talking about, witches at black masses and all, it checks every box. It's a great song to be able to show off what you can do as a band.
I think it's really important to say how important that Roger Bain was to the existence of Black Sabbath, the sound of Black Sabbath, and really, again, the origins of heavy metal, because they all have done over and over again saying how important he was, because they'd never been in a studio before when they made the first record, and they were only in for a day or so, and then they make the second record, which they weren't in for much longer. But it took somebody that understood how they sounded and could create that sound on an album, because that's as easy as you think it might be. And back then it was a lot simpler to do this, but you can still screw up the sound of anything and not let it sound like it should be sounding. And I mean, obviously Tom Allen's the engineer too, but they give a lot of credit to Roger Bay, because they had no idea what they were doing on either of these records, really, other than they just set up and played. So he was able to capture the energy of the band live, the sound of the band live, and get it onto a record, which we've seen so many times over the years. And we talked about it with John Bush and Armored Saint, where that first album they put out on Chrysalis, as great as it was, the production just wasn't there. He didn't capture the raw energy of the band live, and there's countless examples of that. So to go all the way back to 1970 and have these guys be in there and be able to reproduce the sound on an actual album and make it work is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I think it's a testament to what you had in putting these guys in a room together. You know what I mean? So you have Geezer, Tommy, Bill, Ozzy. It's like, yeah, this is what you're going to get. And imagine if they'd had like a month or two and a huge budget, and then they're doing all the tracks and maybe doing things separately. It would still be great. I have no doubt in my mind, but it wouldn't have the rawness and the feel and the appeal to it. I think that it really has a lot to do with these guys actually feeding off of each other and having played it. I think for years they worked this song. I was reading, and the lyrics changed a few times. It's very easy to find some different versions with different lyrics. And sometimes there's live versions with different lyrics. The song is always great because it's representative of who they are. One thing I wanted to get in, when Martin was talking, I thought he might have this quote from his book, Black Sabbath, Doom Let Loose in Illustrated History. He called it an ugly anti-war classic, now considered one of Sabbath's top 2 or 3 most enduring compositions. And I love that ugly anti-war classic because the ugliness of it is why I think people like you and me are talking about it, 55 years later.
And as Martin stated, lyrically, not much has changed in all these years. It's still, you could sing that song and the lyrics mean just as much today as they did back then, which is kind of crazy. I was also thinking about the production of this. They were on a major label, not that the label was really thinking much was going to happen with these guys necessarily, but I could just imagine somebody saying, hey, we got this producer for you that he did David Bowie and he did, Elton John or whatever, and you get the wrong guy in there and all of a sudden this stuff doesn't sound like it sounds. And who knows what would happen then. That's why it's so utterly important that these guys understood to get the band sound and record it and make sure that it sounded like the band, and that's what the record sounds like, which thank goodness it did, because if they got somebody else that didn't understand what they were doing, it could have been a disaster.
It's not a metal example, but in rock, kind of the most infamous example is Phil Spector producing the Let It Be album for the Beatles. I mean, they hated the way every single one of those songs sounded after he went in there. And if you see them doing it in the movie and on all the footage, it's like, oh, these songs sound great. What did he do with this wall of sound that he put in there to kind of take away from it? And the odds of getting the right producer to sit with Black Sabbath and be like, all right, let's do an 8-minute song and see what you guys got. There's a very good chance that it didn't work. And my favorite thing about the production is that the sirens were added after the fact. And reading multiple comments from all the guys, they didn't know that was going to go in there until they heard the finished version. I want to know, can you think of anything like that where the band was like, oh, we had no idea you did that, but we love it?
It depends. I mean, there's a lot of stuff over the years where different bands had like a producer add something in post them recording it. And it would go either way. It's like either like, hey, that's really great, or oh, that was terrible. What are you doing?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But obviously it's it adds to it, and the way that it speeds up at the end, and that dreaded sound of tape unraveling really takes me back, because cassette really was the first way I listened to all the music that I love. It just adds to that there's that tension. The song's getting faster, the tape's unraveling, and you're just like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, pretty iconic. And I don't think that much of that was happening back then. But again, these are the early days of recording any sort of rock and roll stuff. But the Beatles thing is funny because it's a great record, but I know that they didn't like it and all that sort of stuff. But at least that turned out to still be successful. But I was just thinking to myself, like, what if somebody else got in there and tried to produce these guys and didn't know what they were doing and it just didn't sound right? That would have changed the course of history too. So it kind of, everything just kind of came together perfectly for this record, where the band was, on their second record, they were a well-oiled machine at that time, playing these songs live over and over and over again and ready to record. And it certainly came off that way. And obviously it's a legendary record, a legendary song. And like I said, most people will point to War Pigs being the first ever real heavy metal song.
Yeah, and listening to it again, I was thinking about something that I remember struck me, years ago, is the way that the song starts. It's reminiscent of Zeppelin's "Dazed and Confused," not because it sounds the same, but in both songs, you're like, did I start this at the beginning, or am I coming in the middle? There's like something's already happening, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to bring up too, and I'm sure we'll talk about it with Phil also, but Ozzy is such an underrated singer. Like he sounds really great he sounds great on everything if you ask me, but particularly on this one. And Martin brought up the point that he's singing a cappella for a lot of this, and it goes so perfectly with the record. And again, it's really difficult for singers to sing songs that they didn't write the lyrics to, and that's definitely an art. We talked about that in the Blue Oyster Cult one too, where Eric Bloom sang Astronomy and he didn't write the lyrics, and normally he would just sing whatever he'd written. So that's another hard thing to do for singers, to be able to emote. I guess, probably Elton John's the most famous one that never wrote any lyrics, but understood how to sing everything. So that's a lost art, and Ozzy is just so good on this song.
When people are comparing sort of maybe later live performances, Ozzy, and using that as their blueprint, I agree that I think his voice is always great. Even, like No More Tears, that era, I still think he sounded phenomenal. To hear young, and you hear how young he is in his voice here, and it's so different than, even the stuff with Randy Rhoads. And like I was saying before, where everybody gets to show off what they can do, everyone in the band, but that includes Ozzy. And yeah, like Martin said, it's like a cappella. So he has those pauses and where to do it. Ahead of us doing this, I wanted to re-listen to the version from Live Evil, because I was like, I kind of wanted to remind myself what it sounded like when Dio sang it. And it's also great. It's just completely different. I would say I prefer the Ozzy version, but I like the way that Dio kind of put his own spin on it.
Well, Dio, I think, makes it even more evil, because he's got that, really deep, crazy voice. So it's like, General. I loved it when Dio did it. I thought it was great.
Yeah, no, it actually sounds like you could almost picture the cartoon devil is getting in front of the microphone, with the horns, and he puts the pitchfork down.
There it is, Black Sabbath, War Pigs, iconic song, classic sound, amazing production for 1970. And again, all real instruments using there. So you had to remember, that's what I like about the 70s, is all real instruments. There's no tape, there's no add-ons, there's none of that stuff. It's just pure raw music.
When you did the intro, you mentioned that I worked with Dennis Miller for a long time, and one of the things that I found in years of working with him, he loved this song, to the point where he would ask, when we did the radio show, he would want to come back from break to War Pigs, but he would sing along with it. And he would grade himself on hitting the last note at the end of the first verse. Sometimes they go, I had a good one today, or like, no, I just wasn't feeling it, I guess. And it was just so funny because, he's, he was always like a rock and roll kind of comedian, when he'd be on Saturday Night Live, but he's not necessarily the guy that you would picture like, oh, he's probably going to belt out some Sabbath on the radio.
That's awesome. Love it. Well, thanks for doing this, Christian. And thanks for all your help on this podcast. Much appreciated. And we'll talk soon again.
Absolutely.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Credit Karma. When it comes to your money, Credit Karma keeps you ahead of the game. You can count on Credit Karma to keep up with your financial needs as they evolve, helping you monitor your progress and giving you personalized recommendations so you can make strides towards your goals. Make sure you're on the right track, no matter where you are on your financial journey. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download today.
Año Nuevo. Los mismos Extra Value Meals en McDonald's. Ahora te puedes llevar 2 snack wraps y papitas y una bebida mediana por solo $8. Solo por tiempo limitado. Precios y participación pueden variar. Los precios pueden ser más altos en Hawaii, Alaska y California y con entrega.
All right, and now as we continue talking about the legendary song by Black Sabbath, War Pigs, going to bring in my good friend, the frontman, founder, the songwriter, the bass player, many things of the great band Sacred Reich, Phil Rind. I wanted to talk to you about this song specifically because Sacred Reich did an amazing cover of this song, and it kind of became a bit of a staple in your live show back in the day. What was it that attracted you to making a cover of this song?
Obviously, the song is killer. And then for me personally, if we're doing covers, lyrics have to be meaningful. And it's wonderful lyrics. And, like most things, it's the same now as when it was released. Nothing's really changed. It's such an incredible song, and there's great sing-along parts. It goes over great live, and we played it for, since 1988. And then when Black Sabbath retired, we kind of retired it too. And then we just started playing it again last year, because it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's such a great song, and it's interesting that you talk about the lyrics. I don't know if you've read it yet, but I read Geezer Butler's book, which is fantastic, by the way. I highly recommend it. It's one of the best rock biographies I've read. But he talked about writing the lyrics to this, and obviously this was, kind of not really an anti-war song as much as just kind of a frustration war song. But yeah, you look at the lyrics and what songs written 50 some odd years ago, and yeah, you could be writing that song today.
Yeah, it's the same. Geezer's magnificent. I just want to say that Geezer is magnificent bass player and songwriter and lyricist and great dude. Yeah, his book is fantastic.
It's, like I said, it's really good and a lot of really great insight into, the whole career of Black Sabbath and his whole life as well. So as a bass player, what does this song mean to you as a bass player and the way the bass plays in this song? Because in all of the Sabbath songs, obviously Iommi is the key factor in terms of, the guitar sound. But I think Geezer's bass is so important in so many of these songs.
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're a three-piece, right, with a singer.
Yep.
So Tony Iommi's the king of riffs. There's anybody wants to debate it, we can fight. Tony Iommi. When you listen to Bill Ward play too, it's not just straight ahead. He has that kind of jazzy vibe, and Geezer swings, man, and he's blues based and jammy and has a great tone and incredible fingers and just comes up with great, incredible musical parts that support everything but push things. He's one of my bass heroes. Like when I was starting out, it was Geezer, Steve Harris, and like Geddy Lee. And I knew I was never going to be able to play like Geddy Lee. But Steve Harris, with the galloping, bloop, 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 and Geezer's blues bass thing. Now, these days, Geezer's probably my favorite just because of his style and what he plays and what Black Sabbath's music means. But he's just fantastic. He comes up with the coolest parts. I can't always play him right. I just trying to listen and try to be as close as I can. But he's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they started as a blues band called Earth. And it was only maybe because this record was their second record, the two records they put out in the same year in 1970. But what's interesting is that the early Sabbath stuff, as heavy as it is, and obviously this is, they're the forefathers really of heavy metal, but there's so much blues involved in this between, like you said, Bill Ward's playing, Geezer's playing, and even some of the stuff that Tony does too, guitar wise. It's all inherently based on the blues with obviously some originality in terms of just the overall sound.
That's their influence. It would be blues bands, the Beatles, the stuff that they're growing up with. They're so musical and so varied, and they kind of never really limited themselves in what they could do. I listen to something like Planet Caravan. It's incredible. Like Black Sabbath is one of one, and none of us would be here if it wasn't for them.
I've never met Tony Iommi. I've met all the other guys, and they're all really nice, wonderful people. But I've met everybody pretty much, and I rarely get starstruck. They're just human beings like the rest of us. But I think Tony Iommi, like I don't know what I'd even say to him. Like, thank you for my life. I was like, what do you say to somebody like that? It's pretty incredible. When did you first hear Black Sabbath?
I probably was like 12 or 13. They were actually the first concert I ever saw when I was 13. I saw Mob Rules. It was the Mob Rules tour. So they were the first band I ever saw. Yeah, so I must have been 12, 13. And they always just stood out. They had so many records. And then, loving the Ozzy stuff and then loving the Dio stuff. It's amazing. Not many bands can really replace a singer and still be incredible. And they were able to pull it off because, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules are incredible records. If I had to choose, I'm choosing the Ozzy stuff. It's okay. It doesn't mean I don't like the other stuff, and luckily I don't have to choose any of it. But it's amazing how they've had two different, at least two different careers.
And so that's interesting because you came in the Dio era of Sabbath. So when you first went back to listen to the Ozzy stuff, what was your initial opinion about that?
Well, I was listening to the Ozzy stuff first.
Oh, okay.
Like the Dio, that was just my first concert that I saw with Dio. But I always had, the first record has always been my favorite. It's just so incredible. The songs are amazing. Just how it starts off, it just sucks you right in immediately. And yeah, amazing they put out those 2 records in a year. Bands used to be so different, putting out 2 records a year every year, year after year. I think of a band like the Beatles, whose entire career lasted 7, 8 years. All those records, and going from like a boy band to what they became, is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, when you talk about the 70s and all these bands releasing 2 albums a year for all this time, what's interesting too, because again, I've read so many biographies that from, all of those bands, it's like good news, bad news. The good news is they were very motivated and creative in making this incredible music. Is the bad news was that there was so much work that all of these bands burned out. So after 7, 8 years, everybody from that time frame burned out and, kind of went through their changes. And the same thing happened with Sabbath. Obviously, Never Say Die was the album where they were officially on burnout. And that's when that version of it ended. And then, of course, along comes Ronnie James Dio and reinvigorates their whole career. And like you said, they have a second career now with another singer. And we mentioned that when I was doing the AC/DC podcast where we're talking about, because we did Hell's Bells, we were talking about there's not many bands that have had 2 incredible lead singers. There's obviously Sabbath, AC/DC, Van Halen. That I don't know if there's anybody else really.
Van Halen?
Yeah. You're not a Sammy fan?
I don't think it holds a candle to ask Alex Van Halen what he thinks. It doesn't hold a candle.
Oh, I know. I'm about to read his book too. I know he wasn't a fan of that. I mean, look, it's different. They were different.
They turned into dad rock. They turned into, is this love that I'm feeling?
That's still good.
They had their biggest hits, and people can like it all they want, but it's not.
Yeah, it's very different. The 2 bands are very different.
But he's a gifted singer, and they had their high, chart wise, business wise, they did fantastic. But culturally, it could never be the same. To your point, there's just not a lot of bands. Deep Purple got very fortunate, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's not that many. I'm trying to think of who else. Who else is there?
I think those. I mean, you could say Cannibal Corpse if you want to go to the death metal world. They've had success with 2 different singers, but yeah, there's really nobody else. I mean, most of the time that it just doesn't work. A great example would be, well, I guess in a way, Iron Maiden had 2 amazing singers.
Your favorite band, after all.
I know, right? I should. But it's so weird because the same thing. That band was so different with the 2 singers. Like more punky with Di'Anno, and then when Bruce came in, it was more of the classic metal and the classic Maiden sound we know now. So almost forget about that.
You know what's interesting though? Number of the Beast was like the perfect. It sounded like old Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson singing. Like that was the one record that kind of put together the 2 eras, because then Peace of Mind with Nico and everything, changed.
Well, yeah, real quick about Maiden too is that when Number of the Beast came out, I was still working at the record store, and I would say from the metal fans, it was about 50-50. Some people liked the Di'Anno stuff better, and some people liked Bruce better, but it was pretty divided. A lot of people at first that were big fans of the early stuff did not like Number of the Beast when it came out. But I think back then fans were just so invested in these bands, especially as they were smaller and then they get bigger. I mean, same thing with Metallica. I mean, Ride the Lightning came out, and a lot of people in the underground scene called it Ride the Light Bulb because they had an acoustic guitar on there and Escape. So, it's always interesting. You look back on it now for Maiden, and it's like, well, wow. And I guess with Sabbath too, I think Sabbath is an interesting, to talk real quick about the 2 singers, it's kind of interesting because can you say which era is better? I mean, the Ozzy stuff just because it's so legendary, but that Dio stuff was amazing too.
The Dio stuff is incredible. The Ozzy stuff is the foundation of everything. There are many more records. And if I have to choose, I'm choosing Ozzy. Not that I don't love Dio. I'm just saying if I have to choose. It changed a lot. His voice is a lot different. Him writing lyrics instead of Geezer. It changed the band. I mean, the band is still incredible, but it definitely changed. And if I got to pick Ozzy because he's just sick. I mean, I don't think anyone would say technically Ozzy is a better singer, but his voice is just so fucking cool, man. And Ozzy's a maniac. He's another guy. 101. They broke the mold after that.
I always argue that he should get a lot more credit for being a good singer because he really is a really good singer and it fit the band perfectly. And I've always thought he was a good singer, but he just, like, if you look at the top, rock or metal vocalists of all time, he rarely gets mentioned, which I think is a bit criminal.
Well, I think he's just known for his antics and biting heads off back. And
that too.
And your talent will get lost in the meantime if you're a personality. I mean, and if you talk to younger people, they know him from some TV show and all this stuff. But Ozzy in 1970, when you see him standing on the left-hand side of the stage, because Tony Iommi would kick his ass if he came to the middle, it's funny. They have a very strange band dynamic. And Ozzy was always a maniac, right? Ozzy Zig needs a gig, and they're like, that guy? That's the singer guy? And he's like, Tony used to beat me up. And it's like, it's a very strange, crazy dynamic. And he's a maniac.
Yeah, well, they came from Birmingham, which is a very, working class, poor area, as did Judas Priest. And I think a lot of the, so many bands come from, not so great parts of different places. And that, I'm sure, hits a lot of angst for them, especially back then where things, basically in Birmingham, all you did was you worked in the coal factories or whatever the industrial stuff was, and that was your entire life. So luckily for them, they got out of that. So to wind back to War Pigs really quick. So what's it like playing that song live?
I always just hope I can sing it okay. I always... So, quick story. Years ago, we played a show together with Faith No More, like right when the real thing came out, before they blew up. We were touring with Forbidden, and it was us and Forbidden. We were playing in Denver, and they added Faith No More to our show because the promoter was doing both. And Gloria, our manager at the time, says, Faith No More's going to open for you guys. I'm like, no fucking way. They've been around longer. They have more records. No way. I never met them. They're going to think we're dicks. And she's like, no, the promoter said, you sold more tickets, so they're going to open. I was like, whatever. So we meet them, and needless to say, our fans weren't very receptive to them, but I loved the band. So we're watching them play, and they start playing War Pigs, and Mike Patton goes, who wants to hear Sacred Reich play this?
So did you guys both play it that night?
Well, yeah, I think we did. But he goes, come on up. Like, I was down front watching them play, and he goes, come on up. So I sang it with him. And it was at that precise moment that I realized how lacking my singing was compared to that guy, who's a great singer. So he would sing the higher, generals, he'd be all generals gathered in their masses. It sounded all killer. And I'm all just like, but it was a lot of fun. I just hope I can sing it. Sometimes I sing it okay. Sometimes I don't. I'm definitely not Ozzy. But we just try to do our best and do some justice to it because it's an incredible song.
So then do you feel pressure when you're playing it live that you've got to kind of live up to as close to the original as possible?
I don't feel pressure. I'm just like, please don't fuck it up. When we start playing, and it's live, so it's going to happen. It's going to be what it is, and we're going to move along to the next song. I'm always trying to do my best, but that part is just you singing. There's no hiding anything.
Just you and a hi-hat.
We don't use in-ears. There was a night we played on the Sepultura tour in Detroit, and there were 0 monitors. I mean, there were none. Not they didn't work. There were none.
Oh boy.
And, at least you play bass, guitar, drums. You have an amp. Singing, you're fucked. And I was fucked that night.
Yeah, I've talked to bands about that a lot of times when there's no monitors and the monitors go out, and it's always tough for the singer because you can't hear yourself. Like you don't know what you sound like.
You got nothing. You're listening to the front of house, and you're like, that's not a great way. But the other part is, since singing the song since 1988, I'm pretty sure I know how it goes.
Yeah,
and it's supposed to be. So we make it by.
Yeah, and by the way, those Faith No More guys are really great guys, and we're gonna get to them at some point. during the life of this podcast. So, where would you put? I mean, obviously, you guys covered this song, so we know it's a special song for you. But where would you put that in the lexicon of the early Sabbath stuff in terms of like? I don't want to say rank it, but where do you think that fits in their world back then?
I think it's amazing. It's just another amazing song in their canon. Jack Black was once talking about Rush, I think, when they were inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they said they had in their documentary, they had so much sauce, they were just spraying it everywhere, and that's how I feel about Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath. How can one person come up with so many iconic riffs and so many incredible songs? So it would be hard to rank it, but obviously, like you said, we liked it enough to cover it. So I put it up there. I think the song Black Sabbath, "Fairies Wear Boots," their whole first record, NIB. I mean, come on, everything. What isn't great?
Yeah, there really was hardly any fillers on any of those first six or seven records.
Yeah.
And
isn't it ironic that their final record was called Never Say Die?
Yeah, right. I'm trying to remember because I know Geezer talked about that, and I think there was some like people were trying to get them to break up or something or other, so they kind of had that as their battle cry. But of course, it didn't really work. And the riff thing is really interesting. You're a musician as well, but I was talking with James Hetfield at this last this last tour in Dallas. And I was telling him, I said, I'm really mad at you. He's like, what? I said, yeah, all these riffs, I can't get these riffs out of my head. Like I'm singing the riff to, 72 Seasons, like in my head over and over and over again all the time. Just like I'll be walking around and just is in my head. I can't get it out. He's like, yeah, thankfully the riffs still come from above and I'm still able to do it. So, and it's the same thing with Tony Iommi. Like how so many great riffs, and it's still, even that last Black Sabbath record they did, 13. I mean, there was, it wasn't the best Black Sabbath record, but there's still some really good riffs in there. And I mean, yeah, he's the riff master, and that's where all this stuff came from, obviously.
Yeah, it's funny that you say riff, and listening to Lars's radio program that he had on Apple Radio when he had Hetfield on, and they would just go riff. They'd be playing. The riff is king, man. What are you gonna do?
Yeah, well, Lars, and a little bit in Sabbath as well, from what I've read. I mean, definitely Metallica. I mean, Lars would be the one that would say, hey, what was that you just played? Or he'd go through all the riffs that those guys have, and he picks out a lot of the riffs and puts pieces of songs together. So it's a little bit of the same in Sabbath, too. I know that when they were writing stuff, Iommi would come up with all these different riffs, and a lot of times, even Geezer would say, hey, wait, can you play that again? What was that? And as a guitar player, they're just like, I don't know, it's just some riff I play. Let me see if I can remember what I just did. It's like, and it's magical miracle, So when you first heard this song, what was the first Sabbath record you heard with Ozzy?
Oh, I can't. That was
who knows?
Who remembers?
Yeah.
But I moved to Arizona from New York, and like I didn't have an older brother, and my parents listened to disco and Earth, Wind and Fire and Stevie Wonder. So when we moved to Arizona, I met a friend named Todd Fleming, and he was a gigantic Black Sabbath fan. So he was the one that turned me on to Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, and he was into Ted Nugent, and then I got into Iron Maiden and all that stuff, and then Metallica, Slayer.
The normal course of stuff. Yeah, so the first heavy thing I heard was Deep Purple, Machine Head. And I was like, what is this? This is incredible. So I went out and bought it the next day. And then my neighbor, I was talking to him about it, and he said, hey, if you like Deep Purple, you should listen to Black Sabbath. So I think that was Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. And that was the first one of Sabbath I heard. And then I went backwards. So, but do you remember anything about the first few times you heard this particular song, War Pigs?
It just had a mood, and the sirens, there was just something about it that was just kind of cinematic and epic. And
like you said, I think that the lyrics of this song are so important. And a lot of Sabbath stuff was really misunderstood. Like a lot of people thought they were this crazy satanic band. And when you look at a lot of the lyrics, they're actually very Christian.
There's a lot of peace and love.
Yes.
Children of the Grave is perfect, Will they win for the fight for peace?
Yep.
That's what we're fighting for, to just stop the madness, and that's so much of what War Pigs is. It's people don't want this. People want to live their lives.
Exactly.
There's a great quote, Woody Guthrie goes, I just want all those soldiers to lay down their arms and lay down their kits and sit by the road. He goes, lots of rich guys want people to fight. Let them go fight.
Yeah, John Lennon, Imagine, right? What's interesting too about Sabbath, and I think this is more well known now than it might have been back in the day, is that Geezer wrote pretty much all the lyrics during the Ozzy years, and it was kind of interesting back then. It wasn't often that the bass player was writing lyrics to songs. It's usually the singer was writing. But Ozzy, I guess the story goes, Ozzy couldn't really write anything, and then Geezer said, "Well, let me try," and it worked out.
Well, and funny that later on, even in Ozzy's band, he had this bass player writing the lyrics, Bob Daisley. But look, man, and kudos to Ozzy. Ozzy didn't write that shit, but he sang it so good it didn't fucking matter. Coming up with melodies and just his voice, just the sound of his voice. Your voice is your voice. There's not a lot you can do with it. You can change it to whatever, but the sound of your voice is the sound of your voice.
Yeah, 100%. Well, on that note, I will say thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Great song, great band, Sacred Reich. If you have not heard of them, you must immediately go to wherever you listen to music and listen to some Sacred Reich. And their version of War Pigs, which is really good, too.
Yeah, it's on Surf Nicaragua.
All right, man, thanks a lot. I really appreciate this. And thanks again to all our guests, Phil Rind, Christian Bladt, Martin Popoff, of course. Great theme song by Lizzie Borden. Always love that theme song, and thank him for doing that. And we will see you guys next episode. 100 songs,